Hi everyone, my name is Melanie. I'm a second year master's student in the Applied Conservation Ecology Lab. So today I'll be talking about my first chapter findings, which is called Dynamic Patterns in Winter Ungulate Browse Succession in the Boreal Plains of Alberta. So over the last 90 to 125 million years, wildfires have played a major role in the strategies used by trees, thus regulating biodiversity and ecological processes in fire-prone ecosystems, such as the boreal forests of North America. So plant diversity is often highest post-wildfire, with some ecosystems reaching a peak faster than others, and this is due in part in the differences in post-wildfire successional pathways that are dictated by both animal habitat preferences and the lifespan of native plants. So in the southern portion of the boreal forest of Canada, which includes the Boreal Plains ecoregion, successional pathways of upland forests are characterized well by the initial floristic composition model, where serotinous coniferous species, root-suckering broadleaf species, and wind-dispersing species are shaping the patterns of post-wildfire regeneration. So typically in mixed-wood forests, or lake successional mixed-wood forests, they are dominated by broadleaf species, such as trembling aspen, balsam poplar, and paper birch. And in some cases, you do find shade-tolerant coniferous species, such as white spruce and balsam fir. However, mixed-wood forests are gradually replaced over time by coniferous species. And in coniferous stands, such as jack pine and black spruce forests, those are both found in poorly drained uplands and in lowlands. They have serotinous cones that are stimulated by wildfire, and thus these post-wildfire stands are characterized as being self-replacing. So this means that early successional coniferous forests are dominated by coniferous species, and they remain coniferous over time. So as a result, animals' responses to post-wildfire communities differ as a consequence of either enhanced food resources, reduced predation risk, modified microclimate, or reduced habitat complexity. And this is especially true in the northwestern boreal forests of Canada, where moose, woodland caribou, and recently white-tailed deer coexist and interact within this fire-dominated landscape. So early successional upland forests support higher moose densities and white-tailed deer densities because they can support higher quality and quantity of their preferred browse, which is deciduous shrubs and saplings. So although wildfires do provide greater woody browse production in the first 50 years post-wildfire, it's really maximized at 10 to 35 years post-wildfire. On the other hand, there's considerably less studies that have looked at woody browse production in lowlands, but a recent study by Demers and their colleagues in 2019 tested the prediction that moose responded positively to burns within and outside of woodland caribou range in Alberta and British Columbia. So they found that moose avoided lowlands, and they assume it's because lowlands do not provide enough forage for moose, but they did not directly measure forage in their study. So if the post-wildfire trajectory of lowlands are to return to lowlands, thus providing insufficient browse for moose, then that would be enough to alter. It should not be enough to alter moose and white-tailed deer behavior towards these lowlands. And despite the vast literature of the effects of wildfires on moose habitat selection and foraging ecology, the duration of post-wildfire browse availability is not well understood in the Boreal Plains of Alberta. So most of the studies in the past were conducted in the Boreal Shield and Taiga, where vegetation communities are structurally different. And also no studies to this date have really looked into the foraging ecology of expanding white-tailed deer in the boreal forests. So the goals of this study was to improve our understanding of ungulate winter browse succession in post-wildfire upland forests and lowlands in the Boreal Plains of northeastern Alberta. So there's three objectives in the study. The first is to examine the changes in winter browse richness, evenness, abundance, and community composition consumed by ungulates. Two, determine the trajectory of winter browse stratified by palatability consumed by ungulates. And three, test the hypothesis that lowlands provide insufficient browse for ungulates. So this study was conducted in the Lower Athabasca region, south of Lake Athabasca. So in the summer of 2019, we sampled 164 field plots, which is represented in the green dots on the map. And as you can see from the illustration, there's numerous variables that were measured and noted in the field. So for this study, what's important is that we measured all of the shrub stems over 30 centimeters in height, as well as all of the sapling stems over 30 centimeters in height and under 2 centimeters in diameter on the right side of the 50-meter belt transect. So a total of 27 shrub species and 7 sapling species were considered in this study. But due to the lack of the scientific knowledge that we have of ungulate winter browse diet in northeastern Alberta, these shrub and sapling species were classified into palatability categories based on ungulate browsing prevalence recorded in the field. And that was later standardized with expert opinion and scientific literature. And in terms of statistical analyses, we conducted 2 Way ANCOVAs and 3 Way ANCOVAs using one of the 3 diversity metrics. So we looked at species richness, Hill-Shannon-Weaver index, which is a measure of evenness, and then species abundance. And for the 2 Way ANCOVA, we included stand age and line cover types, and then we added palatability categories in a 3 Way ANCOVA. So when we were looking at the changes in diversity metrics over the first 150 years post-wildfire, there's 3 main key results that can be derived from this figure. So the first one is for mixed-wood forests, which is represented by the blue line. For both deciduous shrubs and saplings, there was a double peak pattern in species richness and evenness. So for deciduous shrubs, this shrubs richness peaked at 10 species per 100 meters square at about 10 years post-wildfire. And then it decreased to about 3 species at 60 years post-wildfire. And then it increased back again at 10 species at 90 years post-wildfire. And then the first peak is quite evident for saplings, where it reached 6 species per 100 meters square at 25 years post-wildfire. It also decreased to 2 species at 60 years post-wildfire, and then it gradually went back up, but it stayed mostly constant after that. The second thing that's important to note is that lowlands, which is represented by bogs with the red line and poor fen with the yellow line, they obviously did not show double peak pattern, both species richness and evenness. So in fact, bogs started off at 3 species and it decreased to 2 species after 150 years post-wildfire. And then poor fen stayed constant at 5 species per 100 meters square. The last thing that's important from this graph is that species abundance for both deciduous shrubs and saplings was constantly higher in lowlands than it was in mixed wood forests, an exception to the first 10 to 15 years post-wildfire, where sapling abundance is really high in mixed wood forests. So in mixed wood forests for deciduous shrubs, the abundance stayed constant at 400 stems per 100 meters square, whereas it stayed constant at 785 stems for bogs, which is roughly twice as much. And then for poor fen, it started off at 900 and decreased to 400 stems per 100 meters square. So this means that deciduous forest shows a very dynamic pattern in winter browse succession. And this is likely attributed to the die-off of early successional species such as trembling aspen and paper birch. So these 2 species are root-suckering broadleaf species that are really known to grow in high numbers post-wildfire. So the lifespan of deciduous sapling species is relatively short compared to late successional coniferous species. So they usually start to die off at 75 to 125 years post-wildfire in the boreal mixed woods. So the die-off of these deciduous saplings allows more sunlight to reach the forest floor, and that creates small patch disturbances that allows shade-tolerant coniferous saplings to grow within these new abiotic conditions. However, it's very common for deciduous shrubs to outcompete and outgrow these shade-tolerant coniferous saplings, and that allows deciduous shrubs to persist in these new canopy openings. And like I said earlier in the introduction, winter browse or understory biomass in general is really maximized at 10 to 35 years post-wildfire. But in the Boreal Plains of Alberta, this paradigm pattern of browse succession was not detected in lowlands. And that's because black spruce, bogs, poor fen, and rich fens had relatively constant species richness, evenness, and abundance over time. So lowlands are known to be resilient to wildfires, and they do burn less severely than upland forests. So negative hydrological feedbacks allows lowlands to minimize water loss during dry conditions, and therefore wildfires only consume the top few centimeters of peat. So this study suggests that early successional lowlands do not recruit winter browse species consumed by ungulates. However, when you look into the palatability of these winter browse species, we see further dynamic patterns. So if we go back to mixed wood forests, although species abundance for deciduous shrubs remain constant over time, we see that the abundance of high and preferred browse species shows a double peak pattern, and this is not evident when you combine all of the species together. Secondly, it's also important to note that in jack pine, black spruce, bog, and poor fen, low palatable browse abundance, which is represented by the brown line, is constantly higher than all the other palatability categories in these line cover types. So this means lowlands had the highest winter browse density and constantly higher abundance of low palatable browse throughout the boreal lowland succession. So lowlands seem to provide ungulates with high quantity of low quality forage. And so in the study, we also found that lowlands had very insignificant browsing evidence, which I'm not talking in this presentation. But all of this combined suggests that ungulates are not using lowlands for foraging purposes. They're using it for other things such as thermoregulation, protection against deep snow, or shelter from predators and hunters. So overall, the findings from this study suggest two main things. The first one is that ungulates are not limited by winter browse availability in the Boreal Plains of Alberta, and two, wildfires can provide higher ungulate foraging availability for way longer periods of time than initially believed by the scientific community. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to my funders, but most importantly, my field assistants, Riley, Amanda, Aiden, Victoria, and Sarah, but also members of the ACE Lab and Noah Johnson for their help and support. So with that, I'll take any questions.